but there isn't this kind of, as you say, kind of quasi-religious sort of adulation of it in the sense that there is here. So the Germans would never, they think it totally weird to go out there and clap for health workers, but normal people would just kind of walk out and think, well, they've done their job, I've done mine.
Hello and welcome to Off Script. My name is Steven Edginton. With the recent election of Olaf Scholz to Germany's Chancellorship, what future awaits for Europe's largest economy? What themes unite Germany? And is it ultimately a doomed civilization? To discuss Germany's place in the world, I'm joined by the author and historian Katja Hoyer. Who is Olaf Scholz and what can we expect from him?
So Olaf Scholz is obviously just been sworn in as the new German Chancellor. He is a social democrat, so left of centre in his political orientation. Originally from the north, from Hamburg, as are most of his new cabinet, which is quite an interesting development. There's only one minister, I think, from the south, so maybe that's saying something about where the power has shifted within Germany as well. And yes, he's basically sold himself as a little bit of a sort of Merkel 2.0 during the election, which is pretty much the ticket that he got elected on. Including actually, using some of her stock phrases in interviews and so on, using the famous Merkel diamond, which she sort of forms with her hands in front of her body, and then all of these kinds of things, and got elected on that ticket. And actually, as it turned out now, he has very much pulled the coalition that is formed under his leadership further left than he'd originally sort of portrayed himself as, so we'll see where that goes.
You mentioned Angela Merkel there. Now, she's dominated German politics for well over a decade. Future historians, how will they view the era of Angela Merkel?
I think as one of relative stability, in the sense that, when you look at the long and tumultuous history of Germany over the recent sort of, decades and even in the whole 150 years of its existence, the last 16 years have seemed relatively calm and stable. But I think it's also a period of stagnation to some extent. So nothing major sort of happened. There didn't seem to be a particular direction in which she wanted to take the country. And I think it's a bit of both. If you want to see it in a positive light, it's stability. If you want to see it in a negative light, you end up with stagnation, I think. And that seems to be the big sort of theme, I think, around her tenure.
Her reputation seems to be very positive worldwide. There are these glowing reviews of her chancellorship. She seems pretty popular compared to most world leaders. And, most world leaders, prime ministers, presidents, their careers end in failure. It seems that her reputation has remained solid despite there have been some obvious criticisms of her reign. Look at the migrant crisis, look at Nord Stream 2, look at the Eurozone crisis, how she handled that. Why has she remained such a popular politician globally? Why has her reputation been so solid?
I think many people, particularly on the sort of centre left, have seen in her a sort of counter figure to some of the political figures that have emerged elsewhere in the West. So when you compare her style to, say, Donald Trump or Boris Johnson or other sort of fairly distinct and sort of flamboyant figures, I think it's her calm and the sort of sensibleness she exudes, if you will, that have made her popular, particularly with the centre-left, as a politician that they would have wanted to see in their own country. And as such, I think she's always been held up as somebody who's sort of holding the fort, really, of sort of centre-left politics, seemingly so. I mean, what people tend to forget is that she also got some of the worst election results for her party since its existence. Particularly the last election in 2017 was pretty disastrous for her party. And it took months to form a coalition afterwards, the longest period it's ever taken to form a government afterwards. So within Germany, I think, yes, she herself held her reputation reasonably stable, but it's among the same sort of groups that sort of agree with her brand of politics, rather than the population as a whole, which had sort of slowly begun to turn away from her political party.
Some of her critics, including Donald Trump, but other American politicians as well, would argue that Germany under her reign was a sort of weak link in the West against China, against Russia. If you look at Nord Stream 2, if you look at the fact that Germany hasn't been paying huge amounts of money into NATO or its own defence, do you think Germany is the weak link in the West?
I've myself been hugely critical of that. I do think that a country that is the fourth largest economy in the world needs to pull its weight in terms of its defense and also fitting in with NATO and other alliance systems in terms of security, both in Europe and in the world. So in that respect, particularly with NATO, as you say, they've now agreed under the pressure that Donald Trump put on Germany during various meetings to slowly try and get to the 2% that they're obliged to pay into their own defense of GDP. They're on 1.4, I think, at the moment. So it's kind of slowly being increased, because I think even within Germany, there's a recognition that they can't sit on the fence. I think the problem for Germany, as always, is that its location in the sort of center of Europe means that it's looking both east and west and hasn't as firmly aligned itself with the Western Bloc as, say, Britain and France have, because of the really, really strong kind of economic ties to Russia, as you've mentioned, Nord Stream 2 there as an example of that, but also to China. And because of that, China is now Germany's largest trading partner. They're always sat in between those two camps, basically trying to juggle both. And Merkel, in my opinion, has done that reasonably successfully, but not actually solved the problem. So sort of kind of just sat there and let the problem continue. And her successors are now having to deal with increased pressure from America in particular, where decisions will have to be made which camp you support as the two camps are drifting further and further apart. So I think we will see some form of kind of stronger German foreign policy. We will have to basically then make a decision which way they're going to go with that.
One of the issues that Olaf Scholz is going to face as Chancellor will be how to manage the European Union. Do you think the EU has now split into two sort of blocks? You've got the sort of Central and Eastern European countries, Hungary, Poland, who see the future of the EU as one of national sovereignty, nationalism, perhaps trading with each other, cooperating on certain things. But basically, you have your own country, and that's their view. And then on the other side, you've got the Western nations, Germany, France, other countries who believe in sort of this global idea of Europe, of supranationalism, of centralisation in Brussels. Is Europe now split in a similar way as in the Cold War?
I think that is a huge problem, and I'm not even sure I agree with the fact that all of the Western states are going down the sort of supranational route. I mean, you see this in France, for example. There's huge support among wide swathes of the population for what's been dubbed Frexit, basically, and certainly Eurosceptical views. Even in Germany as well, the last survey that I saw was just under 50% of Germans are also quite critical of the EU. So it's very much a political class that you described there in terms of their views. So that is a problem, I think, Europe-wide. How far can the sort of ideology that the EU has begun to develop be imposed onto individual states and peoples? And the Eastern Europe problem, I think, links into that, but there's also another dimension to it, in the sense that they always feel that Germany is talking to, say, Russia and China to some extent as well, but certainly Russia on the other side, over the heads of the Eastern European nations. And the rhetoric that's coming from the Baltic states and from Poland and from Hungary and also from basically most of the Eastern European states is becoming increasingly hostile towards Germany, because this kind of sense that German arrogance basically means that they think they're just going to run the shop because they pay most of the contributions to the EU and therefore get to dictate to the smaller states how they run their own countries, basically. I think that's going to lead to more and more tension there, especially as obviously with the culture in those states, it doesn't lend itself naturally to a lot of the very liberal themes that we see in the West. And so from that angle, take Hungary as an extreme example, but when you have laws introduced that go very much against what the EU would like to see in terms of its own ideology, and the EU basically telling Hungary you can't have those laws, eventually you end up with severe tensions that will lead to problems, I think, for the integrity of the European Union as a bloc.
Absolutely, and in Poland we're seeing that in an even more acute and direct way with this judicial case. I also wanted to mention Emmanuel Macron. You mentioned France there. Now, he is one of these presidents who will likely win his presidential election next year. And if he does, he may want to he's always wanted to try and be the sort of leader of the European Union, to make France the more dominant power. And there's always this idea in France that Germany is the sort of, the dominating, the real power in Europe, and it's not France. So is there any chance that Emmanuel Macron could replace Germany, could replace Olaf Scholz as the leader of Europe?
I think it's quite telling that the first foreign policy is a foreign policy visit basically to another country is to Paris, the first official state visit, because they certainly Olaf Scholz and also his new foreign minister Annalena Baerbock, who's from the Green Party, they're both extreme Europhiles and I think are going to try and work very closely together with the French to form some sort of dual sort of leadership block there, I think. You're right in terms of Macron's ambitions there, I think. And in that respect, maybe it's a leveling out rather than a sort of one has dominance over the other, because I think they're both kind of very much of the same mold in terms of their vision for Europe going forward. I think the bigger problem is that if that happens, the other states will feel even more alienated, as if there was some sort of like German-French, cabal running the bloc basically, and telling the other states what they can and can't do, and that I think will lead to even more animosity.
I want to talk a bit about Germany's history, linking in with sort of contemporary themes and contemporary ideas of Germany as a nation. So during the COVID crisis, every country was tested. People came together, there was lots of divisions, there still are, of course. And I think in England, in Britain, we could see many people railing, sort of uniting around an idea of what Britain is, the NHS. We had all these sort of, lovely going out on the street and clapping for the NHS workers, things like that. And I just wondered, what do you think Germany's place is in the world today? Do you think Germany has found its purpose?
No, I don't think it has yet. I think it's had too many upheavals in its sort of recent history to find that role and have that role, and it links into what we were saying earlier about NATO, as well, in the sense that it's a huge global player economically, in terms of its population size. Where it is strategically, basically within Europe, it should play a dominating role, but it doesn't quite know what that role is going to be. And I think, the federal structure of the German state, in the sense that those 16 individual states have retained very distinct identities, that doesn't help with that, but it's a necessary thing to keep Germany together as one bloc. But, you mentioned COVID there earlier, for instance, when, COVID policies get rolled out in Germany, it's very much on a state-by-state basis. There are some federal rules that everyone has to stick to, but on the whole, basically lockdown, for instance, took very, very different kind of forms in Germany because of those 16 states all doing their own thing, and that in itself was an interesting thing to see. So, for example, when Markus Söder, the Bavarian minister-president, put on a really, really strong response to COVID and kind of quite a harsh lockdown, his rival candidate for the chancellorship was Armin Laschet in North Rhine-Westphalia, who had a very soft lockdown basically, and each of the populations there, had their opinions on that, and that fractured, I think, or at least certainly showed the fractures within German national identity even further. So I don't think it has quite found its national identity, and certainly not its role, I think, in the world yet either.
Do you think, in a way, that fractured society and fractured country helps? In Britain, London is the dominating city. It's the economic hub. It's where most highly professional people go. There's obviously a lot of resentment, quite rightly, I think, in other parts of the country, because most of the investment happens in London. Most of the decisions happen in London. Most of the media is based in London. And there's always been this tension between London, Westminster, and the rest of the country, and perhaps this led to Brexit, perhaps this led to other populist movements, not just in Britain, but in other parts of the world. Perhaps Germany, in a way, is united by its fractured society. Perhaps by having strong localities, there isn't this similar kind of inequality and resentment.
Yeah, to some extent, I agree with that. So there's certainly not a hub or a center in the way that London is to Britain or Paris is to France. And Berlin would be a very odd thing to have as a center like that in any case, due to its very kind of distinct and almost un-German, I'd say, culture and outlook. It's very, very, very left-leaning, for example, whilst the rest of Germany tends to be, comparatively conservative on the whole. So Berlin wouldn't even lend itself as a center in the same way, I think, that London does. But it also divides quite a lot, particularly the traditional North-South divide, so between the originally Protestant North and the Catholic South, that retains its, I would say, fervor to some extent. So certainly, very distinct identity to South Germany, and the same goes for the North. And then, of course, you still have East and West, and you can see that on every political map that you look at. East Germany stands out like a sore thumb, whether you look at voting patterns or turnout to elections, kind of wider participation to society, unemployment figures, whichever way you want to look at it. Usually you've got this little sort of block of East Germany in a different color on maps, compared to West Germany. So that is still very much an issue as well in terms of getting the country together. And perhaps it is in some way comparable to the north in England as well. Boris Johnson has recently made that comparison and said, in terms of the levelling up plans that the government have, that Germany should be a role model for that, because East and West have sort of managed, in his opinion, to level up more than in the last 30 years since unification, more so than North and South in this country have. I'm not sure I agree with that, but it is an interesting comparison there, because the resentment is there kind of East-West rather than South-North as well. But I don't think it's any less severe.
Before the pandemic, I think in Britain there's this view of Germany and Germans of being very resistant to, for example, CCTV cameras and other infringements on their liberty. Big support for Edward Snowden in Germany, of course, for his whistleblowing activities. And yet, in the COVID pandemic, Germany has been one of those countries which has seen strict lockdowns, especially recently, and there hasn't been a huge amount of pushback. This has been generally accepted within Germany. Obviously, there are people who don't like it, but was it a surprise that Germans were so swift to accept lockdowns?
No, Germans do like their sort of order and discipline. That's not cliche, I would say that. Well, it is one, but it's based on a grain of truth. And also, security and safety, I think, is always something that people are very keen on in Germany as well. You usually get huge support as well when laws get toughened up or longer prison sentences are announced for certain crimes and things like that. So there is support for those kinds of things. I would say the data and privacy thing is a very, very specific thing to Germany in that sense. Maybe to do with the past. I mean, I don't buy into this really simple narrative that people had, the Gestapo under the Nazis and then the Stasi in the East, in East Germany. And therefore they're very critical of kind of state snooping on people's lives. I think that's a little bit too simplistic. I would say that that's a factor, certainly, but that would mean that there would have to be stronger differences between East and West, given that it would be kind of longer ago in the West. But there's certainly a skepticism towards specifically, data protection and that kind of thing within Germany, rather than overall state interference. People are quite happy with fairly strong state interference, say in the economy, for example. That's always been the case in Germany. There's huge state subsidies for certain economic sectors. People get their houses subsidized when they put certain things in place, that kind of stuff. So people are quite happy with that. It's specific to data protection, I would say, what you just described. And also, just to add to that as well, in terms of lockdowns, there's been pretty fervent resistance from, yes, a small part of society, but it does amount to about a third or so, people who are very, very skeptical of not just the vaccines, but lockdowns as well, and have actually gone out on the streets in much larger numbers than I would have expected previously. And it's also got a lot of people who you wouldn't expect to see there out on the streets, out there railing against the government and suddenly being very sort of skeptical. So, ordinary kind of, normal working people, middle class people. You see all sorts of people out there. It's not just kind of, loner types, conspiracy theorists, but it's a huge range of people from what I like to call sort of neo-hippies, so people who are into their, homeopathy and alternative ways of living and all of that sort of stuff, all the way to kind of far-right activists who think that this is some sort of new, state control mechanism to sort of control people's ways of thinking and all that. So it's a huge, broad spectrum of society that is also quite critical, specifically of these COVID measures rather than overall state interference.
Obviously, as I mentioned, COVID is a huge test for any nation. You're seeing hundreds of thousands of people die, potentially hospitals being overwhelmed, things like that. And people want to come together in the time of emergency. And in Britain, as I mentioned earlier, people were clapping for the NHS, and that was one, this seems to be our new national religion. And, there's this whole thing about Captain Tom. I don't know if you followed his fantastic work raising money for charity, which again was one of those figures who sort of united the nation during the lockdown period. What were the themes in Germany that united the country, if there were any?
There certainly wasn't a figure like Captain Tom, again, maybe because of the fractured nature of German history and the health system in Germany is one of those things that is, again, divided into the 16 states as devolved. And therefore, yes, healthcare is free at the point of use. And I would argue in terms of, the quality and speed of it, decent. But there isn't this kind of, as you say, kind of quasi-religious sort of adulation of it in the sense that there is here. So the Germans would never, they think it totally weird to go out there and clap for health workers. But normal people would just kind of walk out and think, well, they've done their job, I've done mine. And there isn't this kind of pedestal for the medical sector in the way that there is here, I would say. It's hard to pin down, really. There was a sense of togetherness, I think, in local communities in the way that people began to appreciate, those that were that were carrying on basically the key workers in this, what people call key workers in this country. So like your supermarket workers and delivery drivers and people like that. So I think that it was a more of a kind of less tangible, more universal kind of togetherness as a society rather than it being specific to a particular sector or a particular figure. And I don't think, sort of, clapping from balconies and the things that you saw in Italy and elsewhere, I think that's just culturally not quite, in line with what sort of Germans do. Everyone shuts their door behind themselves and is in their own house and doesn't really engage all that much with the people around them. So there was that there, but I think much less tangible and much less pinned to specific themes or people.
So you said earlier Germany is still struggling to find its place in the world. Huge economy, huge influence in Europe, but it still doesn't really know how to deal with that. The fact that Germany has such a negative view of much of its history, does that make it ultimately a failed or doomed civilizational force?
I don't think so. I think we've recently seen a bit more confidence there from German politicians when you see them, go out, be that within the EU or elsewhere. I think there's beginning to develop a certain sense of normality, I think, within Germany that will eventually, I think, give that another decade or two, lead to a normalization, I think, of Germany's own history. There's already a lot of criticism now, particularly from the left, of the way that Germany puts the crimes committed under the Nazi regime on a pedestal and raises them sort of higher than other things that it's done in its history. So particularly with the Holocaust, that's recently been challenged quite a lot from the left, who obviously do that for political reasons, as mainly to sort of undermine Germany's relationship with Israel in that sense. But there's certainly a sense that those 12 years of Nazism can't be the thing that defines Germany forever. And I think that's beginning to normalize Germany's relationship with itself to some extent. But there's certainly still, that certainly still overshadows everything else in its history. So it's difficult to see that, leaving kind of tomorrow. But I think over time, it is certainly beginning to normalize. Also now that the last kind of survivors from that generation as well, the last people that are still there, who were around during the Nazi years are obviously, dying now. And I think once that's out of living memory as well, there will be a little bit of a kind of re-evaluation of what Germany is and what it stands for, I think.
There's that old joke about don't mention the war, and I'm glad that you mentioned it before I did. But how much does that war still hang over Germany? And now you say there that the sort of memory is fading as people die out and things like that. Are young Germans forgetting the war, putting it behind them? And is there an active movement within Germany to try and do that?
Yeah, there's this whole, it's been called a Schlussstrich, which means like a final line underneath it. But that's very much a sort of thing that comes from the relatively far right, arguing that basically Germany is more than Nazism, and therefore we need to draw that line under it and just forget about it. And I don't think Germany will, in the foreseeable future, go that far in terms of forgetting about it. But I do think there's a way of integrating that into the longer view of German history that perhaps makes people look beyond that as well and try and see the bigger picture as to how it led to that in the first place. You know, how Germany has evolved since as arguably one of the most stable democracies in the West. And therefore, you know, I think it'll slot into the wider picture rather than being the one thing that overshadows everything else. It's quite interesting that when you look at things like the First World War, which plays a huge role in this country in terms of remembrance, that is completely overshadowed by the Second World War in Germany, and people don't really do much with that. I sort of remember when I was at school, we did it very briefly and then moved on, basically because it wasn't seen as kind of the major thing when you think what, in terms of war crimes and so on, what was, that were committed in that war as well, and they received very little attention because of that. And as I say, that the left have recently begun to argue that other crimes, like colonial crimes, for example, committed in the 19th century should play a bigger role in Germany's remembrance. So there's some sort of battle over Germany's past going on at the moment, and what the outcome of that is remains to be seen, I think.
Of course, after World War II, the reaction to the Nazis within Germany has varied. On the one hand, many previous Nazis were simply forgiven by the West and sort of denazified, as they called it. Obviously, to try and integrate West Germany into Europe and rebuild Germany as a nation, you can't do that without hosting or, rehabilitating some people who were Nazis. On the other hand, Germany has had this extraordinary national guilt and conscience around World War II and around the Holocaust specifically, which I think is pretty much unprecedented. You may correct me there. I'd be interested to know what your thoughts are on how, and you may not know too much about this, so don't worry, if you don't, but comparing how Germany viewed itself after World War II to how Japan, for example, viewed their own history after World War II. Now, if you go and speak to young Japanese people, it's unlikely they know too much about that period. And I think there was a big difference in how the two countries viewed that war. So can you make that comparison?
I think you're right there. I'm not an expert obviously on the Japanese side of things, but from what I gather, there seems to have been very much a culture of let's draw that line and start again. And therefore not mentioning too many of the things basically that happened during the war and before that as well. So Germany has literally, as you say, taken the opposite approach more recently. That is, so certainly sort of beginning with the SPD, so with the Social Democrat era under Willy Brandt, really in sort of 1969 onwards, when he famously went to Warsaw and fell on his knees in front of the Holocaust. Warsaw Uprising Memorial. Those kinds of things happened in Germany over the last, few decades, and history is a compulsory subject as well, for example. So you have to take it on and take it up to A level and so on, because it's basically seen as an elementary part of what Germany is. Every time I go and do tours and things in German concentration camps, for example, you quite often see Bundeswehr soldiers in uniform walking around. They're on one of their or what part of their training as soldiers is to deal with their history as the German military, basically, and they have to go and go to concentration camps and museums and things to educate themselves about the sort of legacy of the German army and those kinds of things. So it's very much part of German culture now that you sort of do this, it's called Vergangenheitsbewältigung, so dealing with one's past, which is really quite a central concept within Germany still. I mean, look at Berlin as an example. At the heart of it, you don't find something like Trafalgar Square, but you've got the Holocaust memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe as the sort of heart of Germany and heart of German, culture, basically, and certainly memory culture. So that, I think, is still very much in place, and it's hard to see that disintegrate.
Of course, German history isn't just those 12 years, and I do want to talk a bit about other parts of German history over the next half an hour, starting in 1871. Now, you've written this book about the formation of Germany as a country, and then I think we're going to go through 1871 to today. So let's be relatively brief about this. But what was Germany like before 1871, before its formation?
Well, if you want to go all the way back to before Napoleon's invasion, it was just a patchwork of over 400 little states and principalities and, dukedoms and basically little political entities, kind of collectively known as the Holy Roman Empire. The name is a little bit misleading, as the famous saying goes. It was neither holy nor was it Roman, nor was it an empire. And yes, there was an emperor, but basically the only role that the states played together was for defensive purposes, and even then the emperor usually had to haggle with all of the states individually, would they actually follow him into war or not. But there wasn't a common currency or a common market or even some sort of common identity, with the exception of a few intellectuals who had kind of started thinking about the fact that language and culture and fairy tales and those kinds of things do have some common themes across the 400 states, but that's very much at sort of elite intellectual level. Napoleon's invasion then changed that, because Napoleon needed to basically deal with with that territory he'd just conquered, and he merged them into 39 states, which is somewhat more doable, sort of as a concept or as an entity. And those 39 states were retained after Waterloo. So after he was defeated in 1815, they stuck with those. Then they carried on basically as 39 individual states, with Prussia and Austria being the two largest ones, as one loose German confederation, it was called, which again was largely for defensive purposes. So they just kind of had a defensive agreement that if they need to go to war or if they get attacked, then they will fight together. That's largely born out of the idea that if they need to defeat the French again, basically with a view to the Napoleonic Wars being the largest thing that had happened in people's lifetimes. And actually in quite some time before that as well, as such a large scale thing that people were genuinely kind of traumatized by it and didn't want it to happen again. So that worked. And then basically the movement to unify Germany became more vocal over that century, over the course of the 19th century. Again, largely driven at this point by the middle classes, simply because that intellectual thing hadn't quite gone away. This kind of idea that as far as the German tongue is heard was the sort of phrase that some philosophers like Hegel and so on used, that there must be a common cultural link between people that speak the same language. But then you also begin to see, because of the Industrial Revolution kind of slowly taking off in the German lands, that people do have resources in one place, people in the next, agriculture in a different place. And if they had some form of common market, then they could merge all of those things together and basically move onwards. And that's why the middle classes, who are profiteering mostly from the Industrial Revolution and the processes attached to that, are beginning to push towards unifying, at least economically unifying the German state. And then, as we've seen with the EU, once you start with an economic market, you then have questions like, how do you regulate that market? Do you introduce common currencies? What about standards? What about having a level playing field? And suddenly you begin to introduce political constructs and structures on top of the economic ones. And that's basically what happened throughout the century. A key moment is the 1848 revolutions, just quickly on that. So people were basically now really feeling the sort of harsh side effects of the Industrial Revolution in terms of cramped, terrible tenement housing in cities, diseases breaking out. And then in the 1840s, the harvest failed as well in several years, one after the other. And that, together with the sort of new ideas of liberalism, nationalism, communism, had just become a thing, obviously, with Marx and Engels having written the Communist Manifesto. All of that mixed together into a pretty powerful cocktail, which then exploded all over Europe with the 1848 revolutions. They were crushed in Germany. So at this point, the liberals did offer the Prussian king the German crown and said to him, like, why don't we just have a common constitution for all of these 39 states? Prussian king can be the head of that. And then we'll just have a sort of more liberal state with a bit of democracy and some social measures in there as well. And the Prussian king, Frederick William IV, turned that down and said he didn't want a crown that came from the gutter, as he phrased it, meaning from the people rather than God. And therefore, that didn't happen, crushed the uprisings and reinstated power. But I think that really, because they came so close to actually toppling the elites, and some of the kind of local dukes and so on were actually attacked directly by mobs. So that this really did frighten the elites, and so they gave in a little bit. So Prussia, for instance, introduced a parliament with a degree of democracy in its own state. And it's at that point, basically, that Otto von Bismarck comes onto the scene, first as the Prussian envoy to St. Petersburg and then Paris, and then as the Prussian prime minister, and he convinced the Prussian king, then the brother of the previous king, William I, because his brother had died, basically took over from him, and he convinced him that this would actually be a good thing for Prussia if they unified Germany under Prussian leadership, and then used Germany as a vehicle basically to extend Prussia's power. And that's how basically the Prussian king came on board with it. And then Bismarck fought a series of unification wars, they're now called. So basically a war against Denmark, which sees some of the Danish territory to Germany, or to Prussia at this point. Then against Austria to settle that dualism between Austria and Prussia once and for all. And then he provoked a war with France, the so-called Franco-Prussian War, at which point that defensive thing I was talking about earlier kicked in, and the other German states basically rallied behind Prussia to defeat the French. And when that worked, Bismarck sort of used the sort of afterglow of that sort of glorious victory against the French to unify Germany, and then you end up with this kind of very loosely cobbled together. I say in the book that it was sort of glued together with the blood of its enemies, because of the nationalism that had basically been the binding factor of the German states at this point. And Bismarck creates that and writes a constitution for it, and it becomes a constitutional monarchy.
Wow. Okay.
that was a lot in a few minutes.
Absolutely fantastic. I mean, if people want to know how Germany came about in a very literal way, that was absolutely brilliant. What makes a nation? And you've just described there the actual chronological events of how Germany came about, but what actually made it a nation?
In my opinion, this is also what I argue in my book as well, is that it is sheer defensive nationalism at this point. So this kind of experience that people had with Napoleon, and then later again in the Franco-Prussian War, this kind of, it's us against them. I think that's basically what rallied the German states together, and not much else at this point. Germans are very, very divided at this stage in terms of their, as I said earlier, denominations. So the South is Catholic, the North is Protestant. You've got very, very strong local identities, particularly in states like Bavaria and Prussia. You would never ever get the sort of, Bavarian King Ludwig sort of bend the knee to to a Prussian German Kaiser. Bismarck, in fact, had to write the letter that invited the Prussian king to become the Kaiser. He had to pen that for the Bavarian king and then bribe him to put his signature underneath it, because he just wouldn't. So not much else is holding Germany together then. So in the German case, I think what made the nation at this point is their defensiveness against others around them. It's Germany's position, I think, in Europe, in the center of it, without any obvious physical boundaries left and right of it, that made it feel vulnerable, I think, to both, the left and east and west, basically, entities east and west of it, so mainly Russia and France.
Now, people in Britain, historians love to talk about our 1,000 years of being not invaded and having this brilliant history that goes back, thousands and thousands of years, this kind of uniting culture. Germany there, born in 1871, out of this defensive pact, out of this nationalism, it may seem to some as to be quite a weak reason to be a nation. But the fact is, Germany is still a country today. It's been through a hell of a lot since 1871, obviously. But in those decades following 1871, Germany was extremely prosperous, and it stayed together, and it was a very successful country. And until 1914, Germany really did well. Can you explain why that was? Now, obviously, it was born out of this nationalism, as you say, but up until 1914, that seemed to be very, very popular and worked very well.
Yeah, it did economically. That's always the big rift in that time period, basically, is that Germany became an economic giant very quickly, sort of on a par, and in some areas overtaking Britain, which had obviously started much earlier with the Industrial Revolution. And it does become huge and very prosperous. So I would say probably the highest living standards in Europe at the time as well. So people reasonably contented with that. But socially, the problems that I just described remain. So you have not only that north-south divide, but also socially huge class divides now, with basically people flocking to the cities, particularly if you look at areas like the Ruhr region or Berlin or Hamburg, where you've got large, slums basically developing, with the tenement housing there being absolutely horrendous. And as a result of that, socialism grows as a movement. The SPD party, now led by Olaf Scholz, was founded basically out of these sentiments. It's the oldest political party in Germany now for that reason, because it survived all the way through. Which in turn, however, threatened the position of the old elites, like the Kaiser himself, but also the aristocracy, and to some extent the middle classes, who obviously weren't overly keen on these kind of socialist policies either. And that basically led to a huge fracturing in society, and to hold that together, and not least in Parliament, where laws had to be passed, and you end up basically in 1912, for example, the last election before the war. You literally have the Reichstag, so the German parliament, divided half and half between liberals and Democrats and socialists on the one side, and then the conservative kind of pro-monarchy forces on the other, virtually taking up half the seats. So it's complete stagnation to get anything passed. It's an absolute nightmare at this point. And they keep using nationalism again as a force to try and get stuff moving through this stagnant parliament. So colonialism, for instance, becomes a thing largely because the middle class is wanted for markets and resources, but also because it's hugely popular with the people. And then once you do that, suddenly you force the SPD into a position where they have to almost agree with that to get re-elected, or else people won't elect the individual politicians back in. And because nationalism kind of, gets used more and more and more throughout the time period as the divisions become bigger and bigger, you end up in 1914 with a situation where war almost seems almost a desirable option, because you can again trigger that defensive nationalism in Germans and rally them together. So in my opinion, it's kind of come full circle. It was born in blood and iron, as Bismarck phrased it himself, the state, and ends up in that, in its destruction again in the First World War.
Can you describe relatively briefly what happened to Germany after World War I? What was the consequences of that war on German society, whether it's economic, political, social?
It's huge, I think. I mean, many people have described it as like the catastrophe, like the origin basically of Germany as a trauma, which I think there's a lot to that theory, that I would agree with that. I think that's the reason why Germany still exists as a state now, is because of the horrendous experience that everyone went through in the First World War. You've got, I think it's 1.6 million in total, people dead basically during the war, casualties on top of that. So everyone had some form of loss during the war, or knew somebody who died. Just like in Britain as well, it was a hugely binding experience. But for Germany, it was the first actual, binding experience where everyone was involved in it one way or another. I think the collective defeat and humiliation after the war played a huge role as well, not least with the Treaty of Versailles, obviously, in the punitive nature of that, but also the way that people shared the humiliation and anger that was caused by that, and all took part in that. And I think that's why Germany got compounded basically as a state that papered over a lot of the, no, not just papered over, actually, that filled a lot of the cracks, I think, and formed a kind of more cohesive nation afterwards, in a negative way, but it did.
One of the relatively forgotten periods of German history is the Weimar Republic. Between 1924 and 1929, this was a sort of golden age of that republic, and this was the democratic formation of Germany after World War I until Hitler becomes Chancellor. Now, one of the most famous and effective politicians of the Weimar Republic is a man called Gustav Stresemann, and he was, in all accounts, a genius at what he did. He was extremely talented. He managed to bring Germany back from the brink of various different crises, including the hyperinflation in 1923, and he governed Germany and was part of the German government, the Weimar Republic, in a time where Germany was prospering again in that very short period. Do you think if Gustav Stresemann hadn't have died just before the Wall Street crash, the world would have been saved from the horrors of the 1930s and the 1940s?
I've recently written a piece on that entitled Gustav Stresemann, the man who nearly saved the world or almost saved the world. I think that's going a little bit far. I think he realized that himself, actually. He did famously say that the German economy was dancing on the edge of a volcano in this very sort of visual image, which, just goes to show that he realized how precarious the situation still was. Some historians have argued rather than calling it the golden period, it should probably be called the gilded period, just because it is very superficial. It is kind of American loans and basically funds from America, which propped up the German economy but didn't really allow it to recover. So unemployment stayed relatively high throughout that period, despite of the investments made into industry and infrastructure. And you have the social problems remain, basically, again, the very deep social divides in Germany are staying the same. And all of that is only propped up, basically, by this brief bought prosperity that was financed and funded with the Dawes and then the Young Plan, the extension of that from 1924. And when those loans obviously get called in after the Wall Street crash, the German economy crashes with it for that reason, because it is only propped up by that. It's hard to see how Stresemann could have solved that, even if he had survived, given that there was no way to stop the Americans, calling those loans back at that point, because they were desperate themselves, and they could hardly turn around to their own people and say, well, sorry, we're going to keep funding the German economy whilst you're experiencing the hardship that you are seeing here. So I doubt it, because there just weren't any avenues to explore at this point. I think the way that he'd set it up meant that if the American economy crashed, the German economy would crash with it.
In 1926, Stresemann won the Nobel Peace Prize. And I think it was, and you correct me if I'm wrong here, but for bringing Germany into the global community, into the League of Nations, the Locarno treaties, that sort of thing. And he made this speech, and I want to quote from it briefly, to the Nobel Prize committee in Oslo when he won. And he said, "A Shakespeare could only have arisen on English soil, in the same way your great dramatists and poets express the nature and essence of the Norwegian people, but they also express that which is universally valid for all of mankind." Do you think that contemporary politicians in Germany and in Europe can heed that advice, that countries only prosper and create great works of civilization by having a unifying nation, by having a unifying story, and that by being pan-nationalist or globalist, this is only a path that will lead to either mediocrity or stagnation?
I think it's a bit of a double-edged sword, because once you've got that national identity and it's strong and it's there, it creates unity internally, but it also creates this us against them mentality externally. So in that respect, it depends a little bit on what you do with it. I mean, you could argue that, that's exactly what Hitler did as well. He created a sense of Germanness again that people could be, proud of and proud in, building the motorways together and having all of these giant infrastructure things that he had, and social programs, like the strength through joy, for instance, rewards for workers, those kinds of things. And they all rallied the nation together. That was the whole point of them. And he made a big thing out of being the one Führer for the one nation and so on, abolishing all of the individual states. That was the only time Germany wasn't a federal state under the Nazis, because they centralized everything. But that was then obviously used and turned, against other nations, basically, because from the beginning it was a kind of Aryans against, you had internal enemies supposedly like the Jews and socialists and so on, and then external enemies like the Slavs and communists and so on. So I think it depends a little bit on what this nationalism is focused on, whether it's a sort of benign internal thing around, culture, food and that kind of thing, or if you're looking at creating a kind of like Sparta-esque almost, kind of fighting spirit out of it. So there's always the danger in that, I think.
I went to Berlin for the first time recently, and obviously I went to the Holocaust Memorial and to all of the major sites in Berlin. And it left me wondering, a question that obviously many, many people ask, is whether the Holocaust and the rise of the Nazis could have happened anywhere, or was it specific to Germany as a country, as a society, because of its history? What's your opinion?
That is $1 million question. How much time have I got? Yes, no, you're right. It is one of those questions, because it obviously the way that you answer it completely determines the way that you see, politics, the world, individual nations, and so on. I think the way that it happened is very not just peculiar to Germany, but also to the specific situation that Germany was in at the time. So I don't think the same thing would have happened, say, 50 years earlier, because it needed the catastrophe of the First World War was absolutely key, in my opinion, for just the mindset to be there and for the economic conditions to be as dire as they were. And then on top of that, you've got undercurrents of anti-Semitism already running relatively high, and not just among the wider population, but specifically in this elite that rose out of the Prussian aristocracy, the so-called Junker class, and their anti-Semitism was very virulent. It wasn't just kind of like like the undercurrent you see everywhere in Europe, but specifically very, very aggressive form kind of that as well. And because they still ran, like the justice system and politics and so on, it was relatively easy for Hitler to tap into that basically and use it as well. So I think it can't just happen anywhere and at any time, because it was so specific to that situation. But that's National Socialism specifically, with all of its attendant like crimes basically. But I do think similar things can happen elsewhere, and at other times it always depends whether kind of all the stars are aligned in a negative way basically. But I think it was particular to that time frame and the particular situation that it was in.
Now, you've talked earlier about the state of Germany after World War I. What was the state of Germany after World War II? And there's obviously huge differences. The Allies actually invade properly in World War II, whereas in World War I, obviously there's an armistice and the Treaty of Versailles. So can you explain, again, relatively briefly, the political, social, economic consequences of that war on Germany?
Well, people were relatively quickly certainly in the West, getting the idea that they're working with the Allies to rebuild Germany. So the blame was pretty swiftly pushed onto the Nazi elite. There's talk of, they use all of these religious words like, Hitler was a messiah, or like they use kind of all magic even. They use words like, he almost bewitched the German public to follow him, and that was kind of the thing which the psychological prop which allowed West Germans to get out of this kind of Nazi state, draw a line under it for now, and try and deal with the problems ahead of them. So people threw themselves into the work that needed to be done, into the clearing up, into the rebuilding of housing, that kind of stuff, and just almost distracted themselves with that. In the East, that was more difficult to do because denazification was really thorough. So teachers, for example, the whole teaching body was just sacked. Same goes for lawyers and people like that, basically. And you just had suddenly newly trained, literally over the course of a 6-week, course, newly trained lawyers, judges, teachers suddenly sat there doing, the work that specialists had trained years for to do, which led to economic chaos. But it did mean that East Germans kind of felt they had a little bit of the sort of moral high ground there over the West Germans in that sense. And then people moved on with their lives, and kind of, when you talk to people now, I'm writing a book about East Germany at the moment, and I'm interviewing a lot of people who lived through these years, and there's always the kind of focus is always on what they did in their own little lives. Basically, there's very little focus on the bigger picture, and that I think made it easier for people to cope with the amount of guilt and just the consequences basically of Nazism if you cast yourself in the role of victim, and then kind of just carry on with your life and try and rebuild. And it's only very, very recently that this kind of idea of 1945 as a dividing line between Germany before and Germany after has been criticized and is beginning to dissolve a little bit.
My final question, which links in with your East Germany book that you're writing now. Do you think that people have become more or less nostalgic for East Germany?
It's hard to tell. I've always had problems with that, because what people are nostalgic about is their own private lives in it. I mean, when I fly back to Germany over Christmas, hopefully, or all things going well, and there will be a lot of East German paraphernalia around. People still drink East German eggnog and eat East German chocolate and that sort of stuff, just because it's one of those things that you've always done. East German folk music will be on the radio again, much to my dismay, that sort of stuff. It's just people remember their own lives and their own childhoods, and you can't just draw a line there in 1990 and say to people, you can't remember the car that you drove, or everyone remembers their first car fondly, everyone remembers their first holiday fondly, and those kinds of things, and that's basically what East Germans are doing. So I think it has become more of a thing, but only because that's moved further back, in the same way that people remember, say, the 80s or the 70s with more nostalgia than they do, say, the 90s or the early 2000s. I think that's the key reason, in my opinion, behind that, rather than wanting the state back, is kind of just looking back at one's own youth and indulging in a bit of sort of rose-tinted nostalgia.
I was speaking to a colleague previously about what questions I should be asking you, and he said that he wanted to ask why so many non-German historians are so fantastic at studying Germany, Ian Kershaw and many others. And perhaps, maybe this isn't true, but in the UK we probably read more foreign historians about Germany than actual Germans reporting on their own history. Is there any particular reason for that, or is that just totally not true?
No, it's true. I mean, I've said this before about Wilhelm I as well. There are two major biographies. One is by a British historian, the other by an Australian one. And there doesn't exist an equivalent in German. It's one of the reasons why I don't live and work in Germany either, because history is still so entangled in those debates that we've just had. Having very kind of real political consequences today, that the debate gets channeled into very particular frameworks, and you can't step outside of them without risking your academic credibility or even your job. So it's easier to stand outside of Germany and talk about things like that than doing it inside the country itself. And I think that's the only basically place where you can do so is right within academia, where it doesn't kind of go beyond that. But even popular history is still very much frowned upon as a trivialization of what happened in the past, and it's too grave to sort of make light of it and write popular history books about it that people can read. Exhibitions are all extremely serious and academic on these issues. So I think it'll take Germany itself a little while longer to try and democratize its own history and allow different perspectives and different viewpoints and different degrees of formality in it, I think.
Katja, thank you so much for joining us. That was a real tour de force of recent German history.
Enjoyed it. Thank you very much.